It is a particular pleasure to be doing this at KI and with Yossi Klein Halevi, who has clearly emerged as one of the voices on Israel today. I will begin at the end, as it were. I will make a bold prediction. There are many books that we read that are important books, and then you say you're glad you read them, and then a couple of years later they already feel like they were sort of dated at a point in time. I'm going to predict this is one that people will be reading for a great many years, and that in many ways is the Old Testament. Now there's no way of knowing it tonight, but I do think that it has a kind of wisdom and staying power to it. Yossi, you were not only to be commended for that, but this clearly shows the labor of love, and I can only guess how many late nights. The dedication to your wife and her patience strikes me as understatement for what I know is an extraordinary project, and the depth and the richness of the fabric of Israeli life that you've captured. I'm not going to go all Charlie Rose on you here, but I do want to ask a few things to start the conversation. A teacher of mine used to say that it's one thing when life imitates fiction, but it's another thing when life imitates sort of badly overwritten fiction. Or as another teacher of mine in a different context said, when the heavenly playwright writes his scripts, they frequently lack subtlety. So the fact that you focus in on the remarkable 55th Brigade, the men who were there in Jerusalem for that seminal moment, Harabai B'Yadeinu, that the Temple Mount is in our hands, one of the most famous moments in not just Israeli history, but modern Jewish history. In some ways, the moment that we thought was going to be the end of history, your entire book is about the fact it's not quite the end of history. In fact, everything unfolds from there. They're the men who were part of the crossing of the Suez in 73. So this is an extraordinary group, and then almost like overwritten fiction. Right? They turn out to be left, and they turn out to be right. They turn out to be kibbutzniks, and they turn out to be settlers. And they turn out to be artists, and they turn out to be businessmen. If you wrote this as fiction, any self-respecting editor would say, you've overdone it. It's too obvious. Give your readers some credit. It's too overly symbolic, and yet it's all shut. Right? This is all real. So, having started with how real it is, I want to ask you about dreams. You start with of course, the evocative 126th Psalm. When the Lord returned the exiles at Zion, we were like dreamers. Then our mouths filled with laughter, but dreams come up over and over again. I'll just pick a couple of dreams that come up. Hanan Parat, the settlers movement, at the first anniversary of Ophir, said, they accuse us of being dreamers. That's true. Here Jacob dreamed his dream, and his ladder reached the heavens, and he received the promise of providence that this land would be his. Zionism is in its essence the fulfillment of the dream of generations. Begin, when he goes to Egypt, Ismail, you say that the soundtrack of that time, that trip, is the Israeli hit song, I was born into a dream, after 30 years I believe it's coming. And then, speaking of Tziat Mitzrayim, you end with Yoel Ben-Nun, about whom we'll talk a lot more tonight, I think. In their disappointment, some Jews had forgotten how to celebrate, how to be grateful. It was a recurring Jewish problem, as ancient as the first Exodus. But as Jews sang at the Pesach Seder, weren't the dreams that had been fulfilled in some sense enough? So the trope of dreams runs through your book. How many dreams of Israel are there? How many different dreams do you think run through the fabric of this book?
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. And Fred, I have to say that for me, as someone who invested over a decade in this book, this evening is a dream. It really is a dream. And if I'd known all those years of struggle and really close to despair often, and trying to get a handle on this story and figure out what it would be, that I would be sitting here with you tonight discussing this book, I might have taken heart and spared myself some anguish. And I really want to thank Rabbi Hamilton for for your friendship and your warmth, and really for fulfilling my dream of creating a community around this book. And that, for me, and for a writer, there's simply no greater hope than to have this gathering with so many of you, as I understand, have been reading the book and reading it together as a community. So thank you, Bill, and thank you, all of you. It occurred to me at some point while I was working on this that there are different ways of categorizing all of the competing Zionist streams. There's left and right. There was the anti-clericalists and the religious Zionists, the capitalists and the socialists. But the category that interested me the most was the division between the normalizers and the utopian dreamers. The normalizers, of course, imagined a Jewish state that would solve anti-Semitism, just take care of that small matter. And what a utopian dream that seems to be today. But in the historical context of the debates within Zionism, they were the lesser dreamers. They were the ones who wanted an Israel that simply would be a safe refuge for the Jewish people. And then in the other camp, you had those who imagined that the return to Zion would be what Jews always believed, traditionally, the return to Zion would be, which is the trigger or the fulfillment of the Messianic era. And in the camp of the dreamers are these two rival groups, the religious Zionist settlers and the secular kibbutzniks. They are political rivals. They have very different ideas of what the borders of the state should look like, what the culture of the state should be like. But for me, they belong in the same camp. They are in the camp of the utopian dreamers, because these are the two movements that believed that the return to Zion would trigger a world transformation, one way or another. And so when I look back on the classical feuds within Zionism, they're all dreamers, really. The normalizers were dreamers, and maybe only Jews could turn normalization into a dream. What other peoples take for granted. And so there were these conflicting dreams between the camps. There were conflicting dreams within the camps. And I think today, one of the sources of kind of a quiet anguish among Israelis is that we don't have an animating utopian dream anymore. This is the first time that I can detect in the history of Zionism, certainly in the history of the state, where we don't have an avant-garde that has taken on itself a utopian vision of what the return to Zion should be.
So how did those dreams, those first generations of dreamers' dreams, sort of run out? And sort of a sub-question, was there some level of respect, grudging or otherwise, for each other's dreams? That is to say, do they recognize the dreamer in each other?
Oh, very much so. Certainly the religious Zionists and the settlers took their direct inspiration very consciously from the early kibbutzniks. They saw Kfar Etzion, the first settlement, as being their version of the Ganya, the first kibbutz. And in fact, I don't think it's a coincidence that the first settlement founded in September 1967 was a kibbutz. Kfar Etzion was a kibbutz. It's kind of the missing link between these two antithetical movements in some sense. And so the early settlers in particular used to dress very self-consciously like kibbutzniks. They would wear sandals, and there was a certain satchel that kibbutzniks used to wear, and they took on the trappings. They had the kippah, but otherwise they really tried the blue. Remember the old blue kibbutz work shirt, and did you spend time on a kibbutz?
No, can you start?
Okay, so that's near on the Kinneret.
That's right.
So they saw themselves as living out the next stage of the kibbutz. The kibbutzniks, of course, were scandalized. They said, "You're stealing, you're expropriating our tradition." And Arik Achmon, to my mind, is really one of the central figures in this book, former kibbutznik who helped create the free enterprise economy that we know today. And Arik is still very upset. He owns the book, he's very proud of the book, but he's very upset about one thing, that I dare to compare the settlers to the kibbutzniks. How could you do such a thing? Two totally different worlds.
And yet you have him at several junctures going to settlements and saying, again, grudgingly or otherwise,
Yes.
you've done something wonderful here, you've done
Yes.
something important here.
I wouldn't say that he would have phrased it, I'd say, in a more neutral way. You've done something amazing, and not something that's good for Israel. From the very beginning, he saw the settlements as detrimental for Israel. But he was filled with this kind of wonder at the next phase, this next outburst of pioneering sacrificial Zionism wasn't emerging from his camp. It was emerging from the group which he always related to as the nerds of Zionism, which were the religious Zionists, the Bnei Akiva kids. And suddenly they dared to take the mantle and say, we are now carrying this forward.
So how do both dreams sort of run out?
Well, and in a way, I think that if we're speaking about the utopian piece of these dreams, then I think that they were fated to fail. And the history of the 20th century, to some extent, is the story of what happens when utopian dreams are paired with political and economic systems. And those always turn out to be disappointments, and sometimes, as we know, turn out to be catastrophic. And we didn't experience that catastrophic disappointment, but certainly our utopian movements have failed in their goals. Nevertheless, I can't call the kibbutz movement, for example, a failure. I think that there would be no state of Israel, and I say this categorically, without the kibbutz movement. And just how astonishing it is when you look back. You know the old poem from Rachel, the pioneer, from the early part of the 20th century. Did you exist, or were you a dream? And I never had a real relationship with the kibbutz movement. I grew up on the wrong side of that divide. I grew up on the Zionist right. I grew up in the Beitarist movement. And this was never my world, the kibbutz movement. But I fell in love with it as I was writing this book, and what really turned out in some sense to be a eulogy for the kibbutz movement. And I couldn't believe it. Was this real? Did this really happen? Did tens of thousands of young people really band together and create these kind of monastic communities and found the state of Israel through this collective act of self-sacrifice? So in that sense, the kibbutz movement succeeded in 1948. And there are those who think that the kibbutz movement might have done itself a favor had it disbanded in some sense in 1948. You did it, that's what you set out to achieve. Because the other piece of what the kibbutz movement tried to achieve, which is creating a working laboratory for the world of the most humane form of communism, turned out to really be irrelevant. And the kibbutz movement itself fell out of love with that vision. So, interestingly, if one compares the settlers today to the kibbutzniks, the settlers have not lost their vitality in the sense of what they believe they're doing. A majority of Israelis have pulled away from the settlers. So the settlers have lost their place as an avant-garde in Israeli society, which they arguably once held in the 70s and the 80s. And they no longer hold that position for all kinds of reasons. So in a sense, the kibbutz movement ran out of utopian steam. And with the settlement movement, it's the rest of us who have pulled back and deprived them of their previous role as the utopian avant-garde.
I said that 1967, that Harvard, the David moment, was a kind of end of history moment, except of course history has a nasty way of not ending. Right? And then tomorrow comes, and then what happens? And it's a great parlor game, to ask what would have happened if it came out differently. What would have happened if the South wins Gettysburg? What happens if Midway comes out the other way? But it's not just a parlor game, because I think in many ways it helps us to regain what it felt like then. Of course, we know how the story goes on, but they didn't. They couldn't. So if you view that moment again, coming out of June of '67, not knowing how the story was going to play out, did it have to play out with settlements? Could it have come out differently? And as I say, this is not just sort of the crystal ball game. I'm trying to go back into the moment of, if you and I were having this conversation of June of '67, what would it feel like?
Well, I've really asked myself that question a lot over these years. And it's an interesting observation you're making in terms of trying to experience the history of the moment, because that was a deliberate decision stylistically. And we all know at least in bold strokes how the story unfolds, but by telling it through these 7 lives, I thought that I could help the reader suspend what the reader knows and experience it at that moment through the lives of these seven characters. And it was very much a decision to not write at any point in the book about what's going to happen later. There's a lot of foreshadowing, but nothing explicit. And the foreshadowing is deliberate, and it's really trying to kind of clue the reader in that some pay attention to this moment because this is going to play out, but never explicitly saying that. And so in that sense, it really is an attempt to try to tell a narrative story as if we're living through it with these characters. So was the settlement movement inevitable? It's interesting that if the first 2 settlements, Kfar Etzion in the Etzion block and Kiryat Arba near Hebron, the first 2 settlements were recreations of Jewish communities that existed in the living memory of Israelis. These were not attempts, at least initially, to recreate an ancient biblical presence. These were 2 communities that had been destroyed. Hebron had been destroyed in 1929 in the pogrom, and Kfar Etzion was destroyed literally on the day before the Declaration of Independence. Yom HaZikaron is in large part because of Kfar Etzion. And so many Israelis saw, certainly in the case of Kfar Etzion, Israelis saw this as an act of restitution. This was not seen as we are founding the settlement movement and reclaiming our biblical patrimony. Hebron, 6 months later, was already more tricky because that was an overlay of both the reconstruction of a community that had been destroyed in modern times, along with, which you can't avoid in Hebron, the ancient history. So Hebron was more controversial in Israel. There was absolutely no controversy over the founding of the first settlement because it wasn't seen as a settlement. It was seen as the children of Kfar Etzion returning home, and it was close enough to Jerusalem. So it doesn't yet become the biblical movement, Gush HaMunim. That happens a little later. So it's interesting how the settlement movement really worked from modern times backwards and almost took the Israeli public unawares and gradually moved the public with it. And yet the Labour Party managed, to my mind, heroically, and if I can let my political prejudice loose for a moment, when I look back on this story, the party that seems to me to have gotten it close to right was actually Mapai, those old curmudgeons of the Labour Party, who understood on the one hand that there's no going back to the 67 borders, and understood on the other hand that we can't swallow the whole thing. And they kept trying to come up with plans. There was the Alon plan, and Dayan had his plan, and everyone had a plan in the Labor Party. And they tried to stop this incredible surge of this longing. Now that we're back, we can touch the land. How is it possible that we won't actually settle it? And emotionally, I'm very much with the settlers. Politically, I'm not. Politically, I'm with labor, which is trying to restrain this emotional movement. But until the Yom Kippur War, the settlement movement, as a movement that we know today, was not inevitable. It could have been contained with a few isolated points. What happened in Yom Kippur, of course, is first of all, labor loses its legitimacy. And there's now a void at the heart of Israeli identity. So religious Zionists step into that void and say, we are now going to carry the pioneering movement forward. And the settlement movement begins. This is really something I think that's even many Israelis today don't know. That the settlement movement as an organized movement does not begin after 67. It begins after Yom Kippur.
But also before 77. So it's not a good political development, it's something that actually precedes that.
Yes, and the breakthrough, and this was, for me, this was one of those aha moments while I was writing this. The breakthrough moment happens in 1975, Hanukkah 1975. There's a mass demonstration of settlers. They're squatting in Samaria, around an old Ottoman train station. And I mean, the whole thing is so poetic and it's so evocative. You know, if you just leave the politics and the consequences out, it's just a beautiful story. And
just leave the politics and the consequences. It's a little bit of Hamlet without the prince.
That's exactly right. And so the Labor Party of Rabin, this is Rabin's first government, wants to remove the settlers, and the would-be settlers, which they've done 7 times before. And they hesitate this time because of the UN Zionism Racism Resolution. And the government senses that this time, because of the resolution, the Israeli public sympathy has shifted toward the settlers. And I think one of the most important arguments, and this is something, you know, as you on the front line as a university president looking at BDS, for me, one of the most compelling arguments against BDS is that when you push Israelis into a corner, as the international community did in 1975 with Zionism racism, Israelis push back by saying, well, if you're going to deny my legitimacy in any part of the land, I might as well go for all of it. And that was the breakthrough moment when the Rabin government surrendered to the settlers and allowed the first settlement of illegal settlement to become legalized.
This is a story of many unintended consequences, but I think of all of them, none could be as remarkable, shocking really, of the UN resolution which had many things in mind, but certainly was not thinking about that.
Yeah.
And yet I think it has the effect that many of us feel, and you're right, we see this on the college campuses, that if the issue is Israel's right to exist, many of us find ourselves being pushed to the right of ourselves. Because now the issue is sort of an existential issue of, now my people are being threatened, and you're with my people, you're against my people, and it becomes a very tribal sort of thing where lines are drawn. When that question is off the table, then the discussion becomes far more complex, far more nuanced. And in fact, ironically, those who would be inclined to be less supportive of the Israeli government position would actually find more of a place in that conversation.
Exactly.
But they've actually started it
exactly
in the right direction.
I mean, if you look at the origins of the Oslo process, it began with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which led to the repeal of Zionism racism in the UN. Dozens of countries establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, or reestablishing in the early 90s, and Israelis suddenly starting to feel that the world is a reasonable place again. And Yitzhak Rabin's inaugural speech in 1992 was appealing to Israelis to give up the notion of the whole world is against us, or Am Levadan Yishkon, we're a people that dwells alone, and saying we need to take our, it's a fantastic speech, that first speech of the Knesset, that we need to join the international community because the train is leaving the station. And the Oslo process is born out of Rabin's sense that it is now relatively safe for Israel to take those risks because we're not being ostracized. So you look at those for me, those are the two polar moments that reveal the Israeli psyche. 1975, the breakthrough of the settlement movement, and then 1993.
You yourself used the expression, the seven characters, as opposed to seven people, and there is that literary aspect to it. So let me ask you a literary development question about these seven characters. They're not in search of an author, they found their author. And that is, who changes the most of the seven? Who develops the most, and who develops in a surprising way?
Well, that's a really wonderful question, because the way that as a writer I divide the characters in the book is not between left and right, or settlers and kibbutzniks, but the camp of those who evolve and the camp of those who pretty much remain the same from the moment the reader encounters them. I think Yoel Ben Nun is the hero of the book because he is the one who takes the most risks and moves from being the theologian of the settlement movement in its early years, its stellar teacher and visionary, to breaking with the settlement movement, especially after the Rabin assassination. But the book traces his gradual realization that we can't have the whole land of Israel and the whole people of Israel. We're going to have to choose. And if we go for the whole land of Israel, we will irreparably rupture the Jewish people.
Talk about his relationship with Rabin a little bit. It's one of the most, to me, remarkable, both on the sort of global political level and on just the intimate level. And I have to say, the professor in me can't help but wonder whether everyone came fully prepared for class. So you might want to fill in some of the details for those who haven't been all the way through this remarkable book.
Well, I spent many years with each of these characters, and I don't remember after how many years of interviews with Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun I went through before one day he just mentioned casually that, well, you know, I had this very intimate relationship with Rabin during the Oslo years, and I used to send him faxes on a regular basis. And if you're interested in looking at them, I have all the faxes here. Are you interested in looking at the faxes? And so he pulls out this file. Somebody someday must do a doctorate on Yoel Ben Nun's correspondence with Rabin. Because here you have...
I actually know the graduate student I wanted to do this. I'm going to make a note of this.
It's the material. One of the frustrations that I had was going through these dozens of pages and saying, how can I not publish all of this? And the book was close to 1,000 pages at this point, so I really had to scale down.
On behalf of all of us, thank you.
And so Yoel Ben Nun, who still in 1993 during the Oslo years is still very much a part of the settler world, he writes a letter to Rabin, and as soon as Rabin is elected, and saying that I'm very disappointed in the direction you're going. I have this hope that you will be a unifier of the people of Israel, but you seem to be pulling us in a different direction. Rabin sends him back a one-line note, which was standard Rabin, but very warm. And so Yoel takes this as an invitation to start faxing Rabin. And the way he puts it was, he says, I wrote the faxes in longhand. He said, I have a very nice script. And Rabin reads everything typed. This way he'll remember that I'm sending him letters longhand. And it actually works because Rabin starts reading these faxes. and invites Yoel in for a conversation. And the faxes are astonishing and so revealing of the Israeli character, because in these faxes, Yoel is at once very respectful to the prime minister of the sovereign Jewish state, and on the other hand, very upfront about what annoys him about Rabin's policies. In one fax he writes, "I used to think that you knew where you were leading us, and I disagreed with you, but you at least knew." And he says, "Do you in fact know where you are leading us?" and I said, "How did Rabin respond?" He said, "Well, I was invited to come in for a talk." And so this relationship develops, and Yoel becomes the unofficial conduit between the settlers who are demonstrating against Rabin in the street, often violently, calling him a traitor, putting up posters in Jerusalem with Rabin wearing a keffiyeh. And privately, Rabin and the settler theologian are sitting down probably once every couple of months, and sometimes more frequently, to work out ways in which Rabin can secretly help the settlers get through the Oslo process. And the whole bypass roads that were built to protect settlers so that they didn't have to go through Arab towns and villages, this is in large measure a result of this back channel. And Yoel falls in love with Rabin, really comes to see him as the embodiment of Israeliness, as the highest expression of Israeliness. And when Rabin is assassinated, that's the moment when Yoel Ben-Nun breaks. And he goes public against his own community, which in the case of both the left and the right, the kibbutz and the settlement movement, the one offense that you are never allowed to commit is to publicly criticize your own community. And that is a law of nature for ideological communities. And Yoel violates the community's law, and pays an enormous price.
There's a lot of tension between loyalty to the group, loyalty to the state, loyalty to the people, to the Jewish people. Can you talk a little bit about how several of them, I mean, Ben-Nun talks about this a lot, but others as well, how both from the left and the right, they see the legitimate authority of the state versus other authorities that can be brought to bear against the state?
Yeah, I think the most powerful, one of the most powerful critiques of the settlement movement comes very early on. It comes from Ari Nachman visiting the settlers who have moved into Hebron in 1968. And he's very curious. He wants to see, he comes from a deep pioneering background. And even though he's already left the kibbutz at this point, he's very drawn to, as you put it earlier, to at least the pioneering energy of this new wave of settling the land. And what disturbs him with what he sees is he senses there's something anti-Zionist about the settlers. And this critique drives the settlers crazy, that you are anti-Zionist because you're undermining the sovereign authority of the Jewish state. Yoel Ben-Nun's wife is constantly berating him for joining with the settlers in illegal squatting attempts against the government. She says to him, "What is this, the British mandate?" She says, you're demonstrating against the sovereign Jewish government. And so there is that tension that's built in, and in a way it comes to a climax with the exposure of the Jewish underground. And what Yoel Ben-Nun comes to realize is that the Jewish underground, which was a group of settler leaders, was a very, very shattering moment in Israeli history. A group of leading figures in the settler movement were arrested in 1984 or 85 for plotting to blow up the Dome of the Rock, plotting to blow up 3 crowded Arab buses in Jerusalem. And what Yoel begins to realize is that the attempt by the settlers to force their agenda on the democratically elected government of Israel is what ultimately leads to this sense among some in the secular community that we are a law unto ourselves.
How many different streams of Israeli Judaism do you think these seven represent? Because you've got everything from, well, let's see, we call them Lodati and Dati. That's way too brittle a description, because they fill out a spectrum that's much richer than that. And with evolutions with many of them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the characters that evolves the most is Meir Ariel. Meir Ariel was our Bob Dylan. He died in 1999. When I had this conversation with my son, who's a passionate Meir Ariel fan, and he said, no, he said, Meir is better than Dylan. And Israelis love Meir Ariel, but mostly posthumously. Israelis fell in love with Meir really after 1999. And
really quite different from Dylan in that sense, that he doesn't have this sort of explosion and become the anthem writer of a generation. I mean, posthumously he does, and he's got his effort, but it's a small group.
That's exactly right. And posthumously, today we now match Meir's songs from different periods to those historical moments and say Meir was the one who caught that moment and that moment, but not necessarily at the time. I mean, Meir's one of his greatest songs, which he wrote right after the Yom Kippur War, Laila Shaket Over Al Kochotenu Suez. A quiet night passes over our forces in Suez. Meir couldn't get that song on the radio. Today, a whole generation of kids who grew up after Meir died know every word to that very long, half-spoken song.
Almost a blend of poetry and journalism.
Exactly. And he's writing, and he's just writing about what it's like to be sitting and at night in Suez and watching your life pass by, which is, to my mind, it is one of the most heartbreaking songs ever written in Hebrew. And every Israeli soldier knows that moment, where you're sitting on some forlorn hilltop or an army base, and it's 4 a.m, and it's just you and a stray dog, and you just feel you're just watching your life go by. And Meir caught that moment. He caught so many of those moments. But I mentioned Meir because, of course, as you know, toward the end of his life, he went from being a symbol of Bohemian Israel. Meir was one of the first Israeli cultural figures to openly use drugs, to be very open about his open marriage, which he spoke about in the press. And in his later years, he became a devout Jew. In the last year of his life, Meir would spend hours sitting in tefillin, writing songs. And there's a great story his widow told me, Tirza, who was just totally, she found this incomprehensible. She said a friend of Meir's called one morning and said, "Can I speak with Meir?" And she said, "You can't speak to him now, he's swaying." So Meir, but what's so interesting about Meir is that he didn't make that kind of stereotypical shift from secular Israel to Orthodox Israel. He established his unique Meir Ariel Israeli denomination, a one-man Israeli Jewish denomination. And you remember the part where Meir is going to a performance on Friday night. Right. He doesn't want to perform on Friday night, but the family's really poor, and Friday night is when you get gigs. So he invents his own ritual, which is to circumambulate his car. And he says, and he repeats the words, "This car is now my house." He gets into the car, Tirza drives, he makes kiddush, and he says, "This is our house. It just happens to be on wheels and it happens to be moving. And this is, we're making Shabbat in our house." And I found that so moving, and in a way, I think one of the reasons why this new generation of Israelis has adopted Meir as its symbol, as its cultural symbol, because this is a generation in spiritual search. And Meir is pointing to a future in which we will have forms of Judaism, and I think that's already emerging now. Forms of Judaism that don't fit into the old categories of ultra-Orthodox, religious Zionist, traditional Sephardi, or secular.
Well, it anticipates what I was going to ask you. I will tell you that moment when he is circling the car and sort of creating an odd version of an Eruv on wheels. My reaction, maybe this is idiosyncratic, but my reaction was, how terribly American.
That's very interesting.
We occupy, so many of us, this whole spectrum that, to speak crudely in terms of left-right terms, is to the left of the Haredim and to the right of the fully Lodati. And that whole spectrum that we think of as North American Judaism often is amazing to Israelis. I think we've all had the experience of having Israeli guests who, and whether we're in a modern Orthodox congregation, conservative congregation, Reformed congregation, they see things that they think that I had no idea this was possible. We had an experience not long ago in our home. We had visiting lawyers from Haifa, as part of the Boston Haifa exchange, who came to our place in Waltham. And it was during Sukkot, so they sat in the Sukkah with us. Certainly they knew what a Sukkah was, all secular people. But I asked if they wanted to eventually love an Edra. And I'll never forget, one turns out, as you'll see by the end of the story, a very spiritual person, but he says, I didn't think this was for me. So he did not know what the bracha was. So I told him bracha, eventually love an Edra, and you can see it was incredibly significant to him. 2 weeks later, he's back home, and Kathy and I get a text from him with a picture attached that he and his partner, turned out he was gay, which I also did not know at the time, he and his partner fixing the mezuzah at their apartment. And he says in the text, I also did not know this was for me.
Now that story is actually becoming more than anecdotal, because we're seeing the emergence of liberal, serious Jewish communities around Israel that have been directly influenced by their encounter with the different denominations of American Jewry. One of my colleagues at the Hartman Institute, where I sit in Jerusalem, Ronnie Yeager, visited BJ, B'nai Jeshurun, in Manhattan, the flagship of Jewish Renewal. And his response was, if you can do this in Manhattan, why can't we do this in Tel Aviv? So he went back to Tel Aviv and he created Beit Tfilah Israeli, which is a community that meets in the summer months of the Tel Aviv port, and is a direct influence, a result of that encounter with American Jewry. And what I find particularly interesting about Beit Tfilah Israeli is that it's been adopted officially by the Tel Aviv municipality. So that we're also seeing the beginnings of officially sanctioned religious pluralism, if not yet on the state level, on the municipal level. And this is happening around the country. Other municipalities are officially adopting non-Orthodox communities. And I wouldn't call them reform or conservative. There is no name yet. This is, when people used to ask me, what denomination do you belong to? My answer would be, I belong to an Israeli denomination that doesn't exist yet. But it is starting to exist now. And the influence of American Jewry is decisive here. And Israelis, for the first time, are interested in what your Jewish lives are like. And this is a very precious moment in diaspora-Israel relations. And I don't know if American Jews fully realize that. So when you say that Mayer was acting in an American way, yes, I think that's right. And he certainly wasn't aware of that. And I don't think he really had, he did live here for a couple of years, and I wonder if that had some influence. But if it did, it was subliminal. Now it's becoming overt.
So, in terms of influences that are conscious and otherwise, I started by saying the remarkable coincidence that they're all in the 55th, they're all there in Yerushalayim in 1967. But to what extent is that a moment that they all reach back to, consciously or otherwise, do you think? And does it animate them? It obviously gives you this extraordinary organizing principle, but I want to push it further than that. Is this a moment that they all reach back to? I'm going to give you, my family the example of this. My late father worked on the Manhattan Project, And I remember before he passed away, fortunately, he talked to him and writing his memoirs. His memoirs are about 300 pages long. I'm born on like page 275, which I found incredibly offensive. All this good stuff happened after that. He said, yeah, but you knew that. You knew that. Most of the book, actually, is his childhood and working on the project. And I kind of knew this as a kid, but I didn't really know it until reading that in many ways, his whole life was up to that moment, and then the rest of it was kind of living out in the reflection of that. And I wonder if the liberation of Yerushalayim in '67 played that role for them, or there's just too much history that happened afterwards, so it sort of got just made part of the spectrum.
I think that I'll answer differently with each group. The religious Zionists saw that as the moment where they were born as a self-conscious, self-confident community, a community that became that eventually took its place at the forefront. And because for them, '67 had such an explicitly political meaning, that tended to deter the other side. Avital Geva, for example, one of the kibbutzniks who becomes a founder of Peace Now, for years boycotted the annual reunion of the 55th Brigade on Yom Yerushalayim for that reason, because it had become politicized. So for the religious Zionists, unequivocally, that's the moment. I mean, the book ends with Yoel Ben Nun leading a group of students recreating the route of battle on the eve of Yom Yerushalayim and leading up to dawn. And he's done that every year for years. So for them, for that camp, Yom Yerushalayim is the religious Zionist holiday. No one else in the country really celebrates it. Only that camp. And they dance in the streets of East Jerusalem and with big flags, and the rest of the country is pretty indifferent to Yom Yerushalayim. So that's one way in which the divide plays out. For Arik Achmon and certainly for Arik Achmon, the others maybe not so much. The experience of pushing against the limits of what was militarily possible, which was really the battle for Jerusalem, was his formative moment. And what he keeps emphasizing, what he's really tried to get me to understand in our years of conversation, is that militarily, what the 55th was asked to do was impossible. You can't launch an attack on an urban area that you don't know, that you don't even have enough maps for, and you have 12 hours to prepare. They didn't know how to get to the front. They were asking, who's from Jerusalem here? Who can lead us to the front?
And it's not exactly like going down to the middle of the mall.
No.
This is no man's land.
This is no man's land, and it's pitch black in Jerusalem that night, and units were getting lost. And yet it was just this determination, this sense of, he taught me a term, dveikut l'mesima, clinging to the misima, the assignment. And that actually helped get me through this book, this notion of dveikut l'mesima. And so if you're asking about just how central '67 was, they do meet every year, and Avital Geva eventually came back and to the reunion. The one character, and this will come as no surprise to you, who never participates is Udi Adiv. Udi Adiv, who becomes anti-Zionist after the Six-Day War and goes so far to the left that he travels illegally to Damascus in 1972, is arrested on his return. He had tried to create an anti-Zionist terrorist underground and spends 12 years in an Israeli prison. I once called him from the ceremony of Jerusalem Reunification Day. It was a mischievous thing to do. I called him up and I said, Udi, where are you? And he said, I don't think they'd want me to come. I said, Udi, for me, this isn't complete without you being here. So,
And yet there's this very touching moment when he is met by one of his former interrogators,
yes.
And they have this kind of tikkun between the two of them. Do you want to
Yes.
describe that?
Yeah, they're at Heathrow Airport, and someone...
Real quickly, I'm going to circulate around for those who'd like to ask questions. We're going to invite people to fill out cards. We have some already. I want you to be able to answer this, and then we'll also involve some of you in the...
Okay, right question that you have in the next couple of minutes. I'm going to ask one question after this, and then we'll have cards and full questions from the audience.
So Udi is waiting at Heathrow Airport to fly back to Israel, and he hears someone call his name, and he says, "Don't you recognize me?" And Udi says, "No." And he says, "Well, I was one of your Shin Bet interrogators." And he says to Udi, "You know, everyone in the Shin Bet supports peace, or supports the Oslo process." And Udi takes this to be a kind of apology to him. And whether it was intended that way or not is a different question. But it's really, I mean, to get back really, Fred, to what you were saying earlier in terms of the literary twists and turns of the story. I'll give you an example with Udi Adiv. Udi Adiv grew up on Kibbutz Gan Shmuel. His next door neighbor was Uri Ilan. Uri Ilan was drafted in the early 50s, was taken prisoner by the Syrians, committed suicide in a Damascus prison, and enclosed a note in his boot before he hung himself saying, "Lo bagadati," I didn't betray. In other words, I didn't betray any secrets. And Kibbutz Gan Shmuel becomes known as the kibbutz that didn't betray. That's Gan Shmuel of the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, after Udi Adiv is arrested for going to Damascus, Gan Shmuel becomes the kibbutz of the traitor. They're next door neighbors. And you can't make that up. If you tried to make that up, really, you would get thrown out the door.
It's overwritten fiction.
It's overwritten fiction.
It's fact.
And it's the intimacy, this uncanny intimacy of the Israeli story, which really, speaking now as a religious Jew, what I felt uncovering these repeated intersections, this constant overlay, I just felt this is a story that is simply not a coincidence, regardless of how it plays out. It repeatedly struck me as so improbable. I mean, the story of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, on the eve of the Six-Day War, before there's any sign of war, suddenly calling out in the middle of his Independence Day speech, "Where is our Hebron? Where is our Yericho? Have we forgotten it?" And he'd never spoken to his students all those years about the missing biblical lands. And Nomi Shemer, writing her song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, also just before all the tensions begin. And then 3 weeks later, the paratroopers are singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav at the wall. And there had never been, in those 19 years, there had never been a real sense of longing for the old city of Jerusalem. It was not part of the early years of the state. It wasn't part of their consciousness. And suddenly, just before the Six-Day War, it's like this outburst, this premonition that Israel's preeminent songwriter has at the same time as this leading rabbi has, that something is in the air, something is coming. And I look at this story really with a sense of awe. And I think that Jews, generations from now, are going to look back at this story, and exactly as Yoel Ben Nun says at the end of the book, will commemorate the events that we have lived through in the way that we commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, and maybe even more so. Maybe we'll relate to this period of history. This first of all, the almost simultaneous transition from instantaneous transition from our lowest moment, the lowest moment in our history, our moment of absolute powerlessness, to our moment of unprecedented power, to the emergence of the two strongest Jewish communities in history at the same time, right after the Shoah. I mean, it's simply a story that doesn't make sense.
So last question for me. Among the narratives that run through the book, there's what I'd call a polarizing narrative that 67, they're all together at the wall, but they begin to come apart, and you have left and right, and you have idealists, and you have pragmatists, but you feel the country becoming more and more polarized, and politically a kind of violence creeps into the vocabulary. But there's also this what I wrote, a Merkaz narrative of driving to a center, and Yoel Ben Nun certainly is part of that narrative. But maybe Yossi Klein Halevi is part of that narrative. I'm going to read you a little bit of your own words recently in the Times of Israel, where you wrote in this lovely piece called "The Quiet Rise of the Israeli Center." A centrist believes that our ability to remain an intact people depends in large measure on recognizing the Jewish legitimacy of our competing voices. For a centrist, the debate isn't occurring so much in Israeli society as it is within himself, with left and right each compellingly arguing its case. And then you conclude, centrists are tired of Israel's internal wars. They crave a middle way between extremes, a way for Jews to honor each other's vital insights and legitimate fears, transforming the ingathering of the exiles from rival communities back into a people. Seems to me you're channeling Yoel Ben Nun, or he's channeling Yossi Klein Halevi, or maybe I can't distinguish the two of you by the end of the book and the end of the article. But here's a perhaps unfair question. You writing this part from the head or from the heart?
About the center?
Is this what you want to believe is true, or do you think this is where we're now about it?
I think we are there. I think that after 30 plus years of an argument between the deaf, between left and right, shouting past each other, the winner of that argument is the center. And if you look at the Israeli polls over the last years, 70+% of Israelis consistently say two things about a Palestinian state. One is that it is an existential necessity, but they're also afraid that it's an existential threat. That's where most of us are. That's where most of us are at. And for me, as an American immigrant to Israel, I moved to Israel, as I write in the preface, in 1982. At the beginning of the Lebanon War, when Israeli society really seemed to be coming apart between left and right. People were shouting at each other literally in the streets. And as a new immigrant, I was just open. I wanted to understand. And so this process that I describe of the centrist as someone in whom left and right is arguing, that was my process of becoming an Israeli, trying to allow left and right equal space inside of me. And that's really why I wrote this book. This book is a kind of a belated expression of the process of my acculturation as an Israeli, of learning to listen, trying to listen carefully to the truths of left and right, and feeling this deep empathy. The more I learn, the more I listen to the left, the more I listen to the right, really understanding what it was they were saying and how right they were about certain insights, but they were all wrong in the same way, which was that they couldn't listen to the insights of each other.
Actually leads nicely into the first question to the audience that I wanted to read you. So Yossi, say something about your own background and how and why you began this manuscript. So you gave us a little flavor of it sort of in an abstract way, but maybe you can talk more concretely of how the project came about, but also your own background and how you came to make Aliyah.
Well, I grew up in Borough Park. Some of you may have heard of it.
In the holy city of Brookline.
The holy city. And Borough Park, in those years, was becoming ultra-Orthodox. It wasn't fully yet, but it was already probably the largest center of survivor families, and My father was a survivor from Hungary, and I grew up in a very, very Holocaust-driven home. And unlike many other survivors, unlike, I would say, most of my friends whose parents never spoke about the war, it was always the secret. My father was very explicit about his experiences, and he wanted me to know, to be prepared to be a Jew in a hostile world. That was really how he saw it. You know, in the Talmud, a father is supposed to teach a son how to swim. That was my father's equivalent of teaching his son how to swim, how to survive in the world. Know that everyone hates you. And so I grew up, not surprisingly, gravitating towards not just the Jewish right, but really the far right. I went, as a teenager, I drifted into the Jewish Defense League, Mayor Kahana. Some of you no doubt recall those years. And in fact, my first book was about that experience of immersing into Jewish extremism and then trying to free myself. A Muslim friend of mine recently said that I was a mujahideen, and I think I think there's a lot of truth to that. I was something of a mujahideen, and so I'd say that I have a very strong appreciation and respect for strongly held positions, whether I agree with them or not. And that helped me as a writer to feel a curiosity about each of these characters. And in a way, the narrative device of the book is that when the reader is encountering a settler, the point of view of the book is right wing. When a reader is encountering a kibbutznik, the point of view of the book is left wing. You are experiencing, you're going in and out of opposing states of consciousness. And I think that having grown up in a very charged ideological environment and then leaving that world, in some ways prepared me for that experience as a writer of really radical empathy.
I'm mindful of the time. I do want to leave time for signing copies, but we have some just terrific questions. Let me ask you just a few of these, and then we'll break. I'm sure this is one many of us are thinking about tonight, but through this time, is there any hope, in your opinion, for the current peace talks? And if yes, what kind of a peace is possible? If not, what needs to happen for a peace agreement to manifest? Or is it hopeless?
And there are other questions too after this?
I think this one is a yes or no.
No, I tragically, I don't see a real possibility for these talks to work for all kinds of reasons. I'd say the shorthand of it is we have one insurmountable obstacle on our side, and the Palestinians have one insurmountable obstacle on their side. On our side, I think it's redividing Jerusalem. And I don't say that for ideological or historical reasons, but very much for practical reasons. I think most Israelis today, if they believed that redividing Jerusalem would end the conflict definitively, I think a majority would go for it. But more likely, what I think Israelis expect would happen is that redividing Jerusalem would, God forbid, lead to the dismemberment of Jerusalem. I don't know of any two countries anywhere in the world that can happily share a capital city. And to expect Palestinians and Israelis at this moment in our history to share the governance of the most charged city in the world, it's one of those delusions of diplomats where they live in a certain reality that's totally divorced from the real world. And I don't think there would be a majority of Israelis under the present circumstances, given the instability in the Middle East, given the fear of a Hamas takeover of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Jerusalem. I don't see a majority of Israelis going for that. So on our side, we're not yet ready to make that final status agreement. And on the Palestinian side, Abbas makes it very clear that he can't compromise on at least the principle of right of return with some implementation, which for Israelis like myself who very much want a two-state solution and see a two-state solution not only in Palestinian interests, but very much in our interest. Without a Palestinian agreement to constrict the refugee return to a Palestinian state rather than to include the state of Israel, it's absolutely impossible. So the most basic preconditions aren't there, and one would have expected Kerry to do a little bit of homework and understand where the two sides are really at.
Last question, and this is one I'm sure you have thought about. You must be much in demand for interviews by the media. Do you ever sense the interview is being conducted with an anti-Israel agenda, possibly very subtle, but very much the way Israelis have been interviewed by NPR, BBC, etc. for many years? How do you avoid providing fodder for our enemies?
Well,
Not all the time, I hope.
no. When I was interviewed by David Horowitz at the Times of Israel, that was, I'm being only slightly facetious, but yes, there is what I would regard as a certain animus that's now built in to large parts of the media. But that animus ranges from soft to hard. And here in the United States, I think you're very fortunate. Look at, the questioner mentioned the BBC. Look at the British media, where the existence of Israel is a fair topic for debate on the op-ed pages of leading British papers. And that really is not, I don't think that that's really possible here. One does find that in the New York Review of Books to some extent, but we're still looking at a relatively marginal phenomenon. And if the questioner is asking, how do I avoid being fodder for anti-Israel propaganda, I mean, I think that the best defense for Israel is to be honest. And being honest means that we're a real country. And a real country makes mistakes, sometimes even makes serious mistakes. And I own all of Israeli history. That's my story. And I think that for me, one of the liberating aspects of making the transition from having been a diaspora Jew in particular, growing up so strongly with a Holocaust consciousness and a sense of victimization, and becoming an Israeli, a process which took emotionally, psychologically, took a very long time. And I don't think really was completed until I finished this book in some sense. And the transition was in realizing that we did it. We actually did it. We made the transition from powerlessness to power. That's not to say that we're not existentially threatened. I think we are in some ways acutely threatened, in particular in subtle ways. We're threatened, our story, the legitimacy of our story is threatened. And the Jews are a story. And we're about to celebrate the seminal Jewish ritual, which is the Seder, when we tell our story. And my definition for who the Jews are is that we're a story that we tell ourselves about who we think we are. And what's happening now is we're in danger of allowing those who don't wish our story well to define what our story means. We're so busy fighting each other about what our story means that there's a void that's been created. And one of if the question earlier was, what motivated me to write this? It was the sense that we're losing our story, especially the story from 67 on. Because what you have today in the Jewish world is one camp which sees 1967 as the greatest blessing that happened to the state of Israel, and another camp which increasingly sees 1967 as the greatest curse. And if we can't agree in the most minimal way among ourselves whether our story is a blessing or a curse, then we're really in danger of losing the story. And I see that for me is the existential threat. I don't minimize the nuclear bomb in Iran. I don't minimize other security threats. But ultimately, the threat that worries me the most is that we will lose our ownership, our understanding of our story. And so this book is one offering to hopefully help us try to start thinking about what our story means from 1967.
Well, if we are a people who tell ourselves a story, we are fortunate indeed to have amongst us one like you who is a master storyteller. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.